In the winter of 1513, in the imperial city of Constantinople, a naval admiral named Piri Reis spread a sheet of gazelle skin across his desk and began to draw the edge of the known world. He was not a mystic, he was not a dreamer. He was a working sailor, a man who had spent his life on the Mediterranean, and he was compiling the best geographic knowledge his empire could gather. He wrote in the margins that he had used around 20 older source maps to build his own, some of them ancient, some of them said to date back to the time of Alexander the Great. And then, near the bottom of that map, he drew something that should not have been possible. He drew a southern coastline, a long, curving landmass sitting beneath the tip of South America. It had bays, it had rivers, it had inlets and mountain ranges rendered in careful detail. And when researchers in the 20th century laid that coastline against the actual bedrock of Antarctica, before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment. Now, then come back. The land that sits hidden under nearly 2 miles of ice, they claimed the shapes lined up. There is only one problem with that. Antarctica was not officially discovered until 1820. The ice sheet that covers it is millions of years old. Which means that if the Piri Reis map is what it appears to be, someone charted the coast of Antarctica 300 years before anyone was supposed to know it existed, and they charted it as if the ice were not there at all. That is strange enough on its own. But here is the part almost everyone skips. Piri Reis was not alone. For roughly 200 years, mapmakers across Europe kept drawing that same southern land. They drew it big. They drew it detailed. They drew it with coastlines and interior features, as though they were copying from some older, better source that they themselves did not fully understand. And then, right around the year 1700, something changed. The great southern continent quietly began to shrink on the maps. The detail vanished. The confident coastlines dissolved into vague guesses and dotted lines and empty white space. And by the time the official explorers finally arrived in the 19th century, the maps had been scrubbed clean of the very thing they had shown for generations. The knowledge did not grow over those 2 centuries. It disappeared. Today we are going to look at why. Let us start with the story you were taught, because you have to understand the official version before you can see the hole in it. The textbook timeline is clean and simple. For most of human history, nobody knew Antarctica was there. The ancient Greeks guessed that a large landmass had to exist in the far south, purely for reasons of symmetry. They believed the round Earth needed weight at the bottom to balance the lands of the north, and they gave that imagined continent a name, Terra Australis, the southern land, but it was philosophy, not observation, a logical placeholder, nothing more. Then came the age of exploration. In the 1770s, Captain James Cook sailed farther south than any recorded human before him. He crossed the Antarctic Circle. He pushed into brutal walls of pack ice and fog, and he never actually laid eyes on the continent itself. He concluded that if any land existed down there, it was buried under ice and worthless to anyone. He turned back. It was not until 1820 that expeditions led by men like Fabian von Bellingshausen finally saw the Antarctic mainland with their own eyes. And the true interior, the mountains and valleys hidden beneath the ice, remained completely unknown until the middle of the 20th century, when seismic surveys and radar finally let us map the shape of the bedrock underneath. That is the official story. Antarctica was a guess, then a rumor, then a discovery, then slowly a known thing. Knowledge moving in a straight line from ignorance to understanding, exactly the way we like to imagine history works. But maps do not lie the way people do. A map is a frozen record of what somebody believed the world looked like at a specific moment. And when you line up the maps of the southern continent in the order they were drawn, they do not tell a story of knowledge slowly increasing. They tell the opposite story. They show knowledge that was already there at the start, sitting fully formed in the oldest documents, and then decaying as the centuries went on. That is the anomaly, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The man who dragged this anomaly into the open was not a fringe crank shouting on a street corner. His name was Charles Hapgood, and he was a college professor. He taught the history of science. In the late 1950s and 1960s, Hapgood and a team of his students began studying the Piri Reis map in serious detail, comparing its coastlines to modern survey data. And Hapgood became convinced that the map showed the coast of Queen Maud Land, a specific region of Antarctica, drawn as it would appear without its ice cap. Hapgood did something that most people in his position would never dare to do. He wrote to the United States Air Force. Specifically, he reached out to the technical squadron that handled cartography and reconnaissance, the people whose entire job was reading and comparing maps for the military. He wanted trained professionals, not fellow theorists, to look at the coastlines and tell him whether he was imagining the resemblance. He got a reply. It came from a lieutenant colonel named Harold Ohlmeyer, dated 1960, and the contents of that letter have echoed through this subject for more than 60 years. Ohlmeyer wrote that the geographical detail in the lower part of the map agreed remarkably with the results of seismic profiles made across the top of the ice cap. He wrote that the ice on that coast may have been absent when the source map was made, and he wrote that he could not explain how the data on the map could be reconciled with the supposed state of geographical knowledge in 1513. Read that again slowly. A serving officer, a professional in exactly the right field, looked at a map from 1513 and told a history professor that it matched sub-ice surveys the Air Force had only just completed, and that he had no idea how that was possible. Now, the mainstream response to all of this is important, and we are not going to hide from it, because a strong case has to survive its critics. Skeptics point out several things. They say the coastline at the bottom of the Piri Reis map is not Antarctica at all, but the coast of South America bent sideways to fit on the page. They say Terra Australis was already a standard feature of maps for philosophical reasons, so of course a southern landmass appears. They say that if you draw enough squiggly coastlines, some of them will accidentally resemble a real place. They say Hapgood saw patterns because he wanted to see them. Those are fair objections. Hold on to them. But also hold on to this. The bending of the coastline that skeptics use to explain the map away is itself a theory, one that requires the mapmaker to have folded reality in a very particular direction. And the Ohlmeyer letter still exists, written by a man with no theory to sell and every professional reason to be cautious. He did not say it was Antarctica for certain. He said the resemblance was remarkable and that he could not explain it. Sometimes the honest admission of a mystery is more powerful than a bold claim. Here is where it stops being about one map, because if it were only the Piri Reis map, this would be an interesting curiosity and nothing more. One anomaly is an accident, but it is not one map. 18 years after Piri Reis, in 1531, a French mathematician and mapmaker named Oronce Finet, known in Latin as Oronteus Phineus, published a world map, and at the bottom of it he drew Antarctica, not a vague blob. A full southern continent, roughly in the correct position, with a coastline that curves and bulges in ways that researchers have argued match the real outline of the continent under its ice. It shows rivers running down to the sea, the kind of rivers that could only flow across land that was not frozen solid. It shows a central region left relatively empty, which is exactly what you would expect if the interior were a high, inhospitable plateau. Hapgood studied this map too, and he became convinced that Finet had been working from source documents even older and even better than the ones Piri Reis used. Think about what that means. Two different map makers, in two different countries, working less than 20 years apart, both drawing the same impossible continent. They were not copying each other. They were copying from something behind both of them, some older reservoir of knowledge that each of them tapped into separately. Then comes Gerardus Mercator, the most famous cartographer in history, the man whose map projection still shapes how you picture the world today. In 1569, Mercator produced his Great World Map, and there again sits the vast southern continent, drawn with a confidence that suggests he considered it established fact, not speculation. Mercator was the gold standard of his age. He did not put things on maps casually. If Mercator drew a southern land with that much certainty, he believed he had a source worth trusting. And the strangest one of all comes later, from a French geographer named Philippe Boichet in the year 1739. Boichet published a map of the southern continent that showed Antarctica not as a single landmass, but as two separate landmasses divided by a channel of water running through the middle, a waterway splitting the continent in half. For centuries that looked like an error, because Antarctica is obviously one solid continent, except it is not. In the 1950s, when scientists finally used seismic soundings to map the bedrock beneath the ice, they discovered that Antarctica is in fact two major land masses, East Antarctica and West Antarctica, separated by a deep subglacial basin. If you stripped away the ice, the continent could be read as two lands divided by water, exactly the way Bourchier drew it in 1739, more than 200 years before we had the technology to know. Bourchier himself never saw Antarctica. Nobody in 1739 had. He wrote that he was drawing the southern land based on older sources and reasoning. But how do you reason your way to the correct hidden shape of a continent that would not be measured for another 2 centuries? You do not reason your way there. You copy it from someone who already knew. So now we have a pattern. And the pattern is the whole point. Piri Reis in 1513. Orontius Phineus in 1531. Mercator in 1569. Bourchier in 1739. 4 mapmakers across more than 200 years, none of whom could have visited Antarctica, all of whom drew it with details that would not be independently confirmed until the age of radar and seismographs. And they all pointed to the same explanation. They were not the source of the knowledge. They were copies, downstream copies of some upstream original that none of them ever fully understood, which forces the real question, the one that changes everything. If these men were copying, who made the original? Who mapped an ice-free Antarctica? And when? And with what tools? And where did they go? This is the doorway, and when you walk through it, you leave the safe halls of ordinary history and step into something much larger and much stranger. To understand what might be on the other side of that door, you have to understand how maps actually travelled through the ancient world, because they did not travel the way you think. We imagine each generation of explorers adding a little more to the map, building slowly outward. But the real history of cartography is a history of loss. Great libraries burned, empires collapsed and took their archives with them. Knowledge that took centuries to gather could vanish in a single afternoon of fire. The most famous example is the Library of Alexandria in Egypt. For centuries it was the greatest collection of knowledge on earth. Scholars believe it held tens of thousands of scrolls, including geographic and navigational records gathered from every corner of the ancient trading world, from Phoenician sailors, from Egyptian priests, from Greek astronomers, from mariners whose names we will never know. And then it was destroyed, slowly, in stages, over centuries, until almost nothing remained. But here is the thing about a library that big. Before it burns, copies leak out. Scrolls get borrowed, merchants carry duplicates to distant cities, and Hapgood argued that fragments of that lost ancient geography survived precisely this way, passed hand to hand through the medieval world, copied and recopied by people who did not understand what they were holding, until they finally landed on the desks of Renaissance mapmakers like Piri Reis, who then combined them into new charts, without ever grasping that they were preserving the memory of a civilization far older than their own. That is Hapgood's theory in its careful, academic form. Ancient sea kings, he called them. A lost maritime people, advanced enough in navigation and mathematics to map the entire planet, including a then habitable, or at least ice-free Antarctica, whose knowledge survived only as scattered fragments after the parent civilization was gone. Now, mainstream academia rejected this. They called it speculation built on coincidence. And within the rules of conventional history, they had grounds too. But a growing number of independent researchers looked at Hapgood's evidence and asked a much bolder question. What if he did not go far enough? What if the source was not just some clever ancient sailors, but an entire global civilization that we have been taught, very deliberately, to forget? This is where the story connects to something that has spread across the internet like wildfire over the last decade, a word you may have heard whispered in strange corners of the web: Tartaria. Let me explain what that word actually points to, because it is far more grounded than its reputation suggests. On maps printed across Europe from the 1500s all the way into the 1800s, an enormous region of the earth is labelled with a single name, Tartary, or Grand Tartary. It stretched across a colossal swath of the northern hemisphere, covering much of what is now Central Asia, Siberia, and beyond. It appears on maps by respected cartographers. It appears in encyclopedias. The early editions of the Encyclopaedia Britannica describe Tartary as a vast country in the northern parts of Asia. This is not a hidden document. It was mainstream reference material for centuries. And then, like the southern continent on those old maps, Tartary vanished, not conquered in a single famous war, not dramatically destroyed in a way children learn about in school. It simply faded off the maps and out of the textbooks, broken up, relabeled, and quietly forgotten, until most people alive today have never heard the name at all, despite the fact that it dominated world maps for 300 years. The conventional explanation is that Tartary was never a unified nation to begin with. It was a loose European catch-all term, historians say, a lazy label that Westerners slapped onto a huge region full of nomadic peoples they did not understand or care to distinguish. As those Europeans learned more, the argument goes, they replaced the vague word Tartary with more accurate names for the specific peoples and states of the region. Nothing was erased. The map just got more precise. That is a reasonable explanation. But it leaves a lot unanswered, and the people who study this refuse to let it go, because the same window of time keeps appearing. The southern continent starts disappearing from maps around 1700. Tartary starts disappearing from the record in the same era, fading through the 1700s and gone by the 1800s. The confident old geography, full of lands and detail, gets replaced across the board by a newer, cleaner, more controlled version of the world. And the researchers who chase this pattern started asking a question that sounds insane at first and then refuses to leave you alone. What if a great deal of history was rewritten in a relatively narrow window of time, and the old maps are the last surviving witnesses to a world that was deliberately erased? That is the heart of the Tartaria hypothesis. It claims that there was once a highly advanced global civilization, unified in ways we are not taught, with a mastery of architecture, energy, and yes, cartography, that rivaled or exceeded our own. And it claims that this civilization was brought down and paved over, its buildings reattributed to later powers, its records destroyed or rewritten, its very name scrubbed from common memory, all within the last few centuries. The old maps of an ice-free Antarctica and a mighty northern Tartary are, in this view, two pieces of the same broken mirror. I know how that sounds. Stay with me, because the next part is where the economics come in, and economics is where you find motive, and motive is what turns a coincidence into a case. Ask yourself a simple question. Who benefits from controlling a map? We think of maps as neutral, just pictures of the land, but for most of recorded history, an accurate map was one of the most valuable and most jealously guarded objects a person could own. A map was money. A map was power. A map was the difference between a trading fleet that came home rich and one that vanished into the ocean. Nations executed people for stealing charts. The routes to the Spice Islands, the safe passages, the locations of resources, all of it was locked away as state and commercial secrets worth more than gold. Think about the great trading companies that rose in exactly the period we keep circling back to, the 1600s and 1700s, the Dutch East India Company, the British East India Company. These were not simple businesses. They were among the most powerful economic and military entities that have ever existed. They had their own armies, they had their own navies, they minted money, they waged wars, they ran entire territories. And they understood something with perfect clarity. Whoever controls the flow of geographic knowledge controls the flow of wealth. Now layer that onto the timeline. The era when the old, detailed, anomalous world maps get replaced by newer, cleaner, official ones is the exact era when a small number of European trading powers were consolidating control over the entire planet's commerce. It is the era when knowledge itself was being centralized, standardized, and locked down. Printing was regulated, guilds controlled crafts, universities were reshaped, and the picture of the world that ordinary people were allowed to see was increasingly whatever the dominant powers decided it should be. From that angle, the disappearance of inconvenient geography stops looking like the innocent march of progress. It starts looking like curation. Somebody decided what stayed on the map and what came off. And the things that came off were, conveniently, the things that did not fit the official story those powers were building. A southern continent that implied a lost advanced civilization, a northern empire that implied there had been a rival to European dominance. Both were quietly retired, and a cleaner, more manageable world took their place. This is what the researchers mean when they call it revisionist economic history. Not that the physical continents moved, but that the story of who knew what, and who built what, and who owned what, was rewritten by the winners of a very specific economic struggle. And the maps, those stubborn old documents that were printed before the cleanup was complete, are the receipts that the rewriters forgot to burn. Let us go back to the physical evidence, because a theory is only as strong as the objects it can point to, and there are more objects than most people realize. Consider the level of precision on some of these old charts, because precision is the thing that is truly hard to explain away. The Piri Reis map, and others like it, show relationships between distant points, the relative positions and longitudes of places thousands of miles apart, with an accuracy that should have been impossible for its era. Longitude, the measurement of how far east or west you are, was famously one of the hardest problems in all of navigation. European nations offered enormous prizes for solving it. Sailors died for lack of it. A reliable method for finding longitude at sea was not developed until the mid-1700s, when John Harrison built his marine chronometer after a lifetime of work. And yet the accurate placement of far-flung coastlines on some of these older maps implies a working knowledge of longitude and of the true size and curvature of the Earth, centuries before it was supposedly available. You cannot draw the correct relative positions of continents without understanding the mathematics of a sphere. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. Whoever made the original source maps had that understanding. The Renaissance copyists who reproduced them mostly did not, which is exactly why the copies contain brilliant accuracy sitting right next to obvious confusion. That is the fingerprint of copying from a source you do not fully comprehend. The genius belongs to the original. The mistakes belong to the copyist. Now put that fingerprint against the whole pattern. Accurate ancient geography, decaying as it passes through hands that do not understand it until the cleanup era arrives and the awkward parts are removed entirely. It is the same story told by the ice-free Antarctica maps, the same story told by the vanishing of Tartary, the same story told by the sudden convenient standardization of the world's picture right as a handful of powers seized control of global trade, different pieces, one shape. And there is a human cost buried in this story too, which is where it stops being an abstract puzzle about old paper and starts to ache a little. The researchers who go deepest into this subject talk about the strange gaps in the record around this same period. They point to old photographs of massive, ornate buildings that supposedly appeared in cities almost overnight, structures of a scale and craftsmanship that the official history struggles to fully account for. They point to buildings whose lower floors sit buried below modern street level, as though the ground rose up around them, or a flood of mud and sediment swept through and was never explained. Mud flood, they call it. They point to census gaps, to orphaned children moved across countries in great numbers, to populations that seem to reset. They ask why so many grand buildings from that era were later demolished, and why the explanations for their origins so often feel thin. None of that proves the grand claim. Every one of those threads has a conventional answer, and skeptics will give you those answers with total confidence. The buildings were built by known architects in known styles. The buried floors are the ordinary result of cities rising over centuries. The mud is just how old cities work, and maybe they are right. But the researchers are not asking you to swallow the whole thing at once. They are asking you to notice how many separate anomalies cluster around the exact same window of time. The maps change. The southern continent vanishes. Tartary vanishes. The architecture shifts. The records blur. The economic powers consolidate. All of it in the same handful of decades bracketing the year 1700. At some point, a reasonable person stops calling that a series of coincidences and starts calling it a pattern, and a pattern demands an explanation. And it is worth slowing down here, because the 4 maps we have named are not even the full list. They are just the famous ones. Once you start pulling on this thread, more of them keep falling out of the archives, and each one deepens the same impossible pattern. There is a map attributed to 2 brothers named Zeno, published in the 1550s but claiming to be based on voyages made 2 centuries earlier in the 1300s. It shows the North Atlantic, Greenland, and surrounding lands with a level of detail that startled the researchers who examined it. It renders parts of Greenland's coastline that were, at the time of publication, still buried under ice, coastlines that would only be confirmed by modern glacial surveys. Once again, the same signature. A map that seems to show land the way it looked before the ice arrived, drawn by people who had no way to see beneath a glacier. There is a map made by a cartographer known as Haji Ahmed, dated to the 1550s, that shows a land bridge connecting Siberia to Alaska across the Bering Strait. That land bridge is real. Geologists call it Beringia, and it existed during the last ice age, when so much of the world's water was locked up in glaciers that sea levels dropped and the ocean floor became dry, walkable land. But that land bridge sank beneath the waves thousands and thousands of years ago. There was no one around in the 1550s who could have surveyed it. And yet there it is, drawn on the map, a connection between 2 continents that had not existed for longer than recorded civilization is supposed to have lasted. Then there are the Portolan charts, and these might be the quietest scandal of all. Portolans were medieval sea charts, covered in criss-crossing lines that mariners used to navigate. They started appearing in Europe in the 1200s and 1300s, seemingly out of nowhere, and here is the puzzle that historians have never fully solved. The earliest Portolan charts are, in many cases, more geometrically accurate than the ones that came after them. They depict the Mediterranean and Black Sea coastlines with a precision that the science and instruments of the 1300s should not have been able to produce. The first ones are the best ones, and the quality drifts downward from there. That is the copying fingerprint again, showing up in an entirely different family of documents. A brilliant original, faithfully traced by hands that could not have generated that brilliance on their own, slowly degrading as it moves through time. Put all of it together and the picture becomes very hard to wave away. Antarctica before its ice, Greenland before its ice. A land bridge from the last glacial age. Sea charts more accurate at their birth than in their maturity. This is not one anomaly that a clever skeptic can bend back into shape. This is a whole class of documents, from different centuries and different nations, all whispering the same thing. There was an earlier source, a better source, a source that saw the world in a state it has not been in for a very long time. Which brings us to the hardest question in this entire subject, the one that Hapgood himself wrestled with for years. If someone mapped Antarctica without its ice, then at some point in the past, Antarctica did not have its ice. So what happened? How does a continent go from ice-free to buried under 2 miles of glacier, and could it have happened recently enough for human beings to have seen it and drawn it? Hapgood's answer was radical, and it earned him both fascination and ridicule. He proposed a theory he called Earth crustal displacement. The idea is that the entire outer shell of the planet, the crust we all live on, can under certain conditions slide as a single piece over the softer material beneath it. Not the slow grinding of individual tectonic plates that geologists study today, but a sudden, large-scale shift of the whole crust at once. In such an event, land that once sat in a temperate zone could be dragged toward the pole, and land near the pole could be dragged toward warmer latitudes, over a span of time far shorter than conventional geology would ever allow. If Hapgood was right, then Antarctica might have sat in a warmer, ice-free position in the not-so-distant past, been mapped by whoever was there to map it, and then been carried to the bottom of the world by one of these displacements, freezing over in what might have felt, to anyone watching, like the end of an age. It is a stunning idea, and it caught the attention of one of the most famous scientists who ever lived. Albert Einstein read Hapgood's work, corresponded with him, and even wrote a foreword for one of his books, saying the idea was of great importance to everything that relates to the history of the Earth's surface. Einstein did not endorse every detail, But he took it seriously enough to put his name near it, and that alone should tell you this was never the work of a simple crank. Mainstream geology rejects crustal displacement in the sudden form Hapgood described. Plate tectonics, the accepted model, moves continents at the pace your fingernails grow, far too slowly to freeze a mapped continent within human memory, and that objection is a serious one. But notice what the objection does. It does not explain the maps. It only insists that the maps cannot mean what they appear to mean because the geology forbids it. And that is the entire tension of this subject in a single sentence. The physical documents point one way, the accepted theory points the other, and you are left standing between them, holding a coastline drawn in 1513, forced to decide which one you trust. Now let us go deeper into the economics, because this is where the story stops being a curiosity about old paper and starts being a story about power, and power always leaves a trail. Return to that window around the year 1700 and look at what was actually happening to the world in those decades. This was the moment when a small cluster of European powers, working hand in glove with their great chartered trading companies, were finishing the job of wrapping their control around the entire globe. Trade routes that had once been shared and contested were being locked down, ports were being seized, and critically, the flow of information was being funneled through a shrinking number of official channels. Consider what a map represented to one of these companies. It was not decoration, it was the master key to the treasure. A company that knew the true shape of the world, the real currents, the hidden passages, the locations of resources, held an advantage over every rival that did not. And the flip side of that logic is just as sharp. Any old knowledge floating around out there, any inconvenient map suggesting there were things in the world the companies did not control, or civilizations that had come before them and done it better, was a threat to the story of their supremacy. The most valuable thing these powers were building was not just wealth, it was legitimacy, the belief that their order was the natural and inevitable state of the world. And nothing threatens the belief in a natural, inevitable order quite like physical evidence that a different order existed first. Think about the printing press and what it really did over these centuries. We are taught it democratized knowledge, and in one sense it did. But it also standardized knowledge in a way that had never been possible before. When every map was drawn by hand, a strange or heretical geography could survive quietly in a single copy in a single library. But once printing took over, whatever went onto the master plate became the version everyone received, thousands of identical copies flooding the market, drowning out the hand-drawn oddities. And whoever controlled the presses, the publishing houses, the official cartographers of the Crown and the Company, controlled which version of the world became the real one in the public mind. The old maps were not necessarily burned in a dramatic bonfire. They were simply outprinted, buried under an avalanche of the new, sanctioned, cleaned-up geography until the old versions became curiosities that only a few collectors even remembered existed. This is what a rewriting of history actually looks like when it happens in the real world. It is rarely a single dramatic act of destruction. It is a slow substitution, a gradual replacement of the messy, inconvenient, anomaly-filled record with a tidy, official, easily controlled one. And it tends to happen exactly when a new power is consolidating and needs the past to line up neatly behind its claim to the present. The disappearance of the ice-free southern continent, the fading of Grand Tartary, the standardization of the world's map, all of it clustering in the same era as the rise of the great trading empires, is either the largest coincidence in the history of knowledge, or it is the fingerprint of exactly this kind of substitution. And once you are willing to entertain that, the Tartaria researchers push you toward the buildings, because they argue the same substitution happened to architecture that happened to the maps. They point to the star forts, those geometrically perfect fortifications shaped like many pointed stars that appear all across the world, on nearly every continent, built in styles so consistent and so widespread that it looks, they argue, like the signature of a single global culture rather than dozens of separate ones. They point to the grand exhibition halls and palaces of the 1800s, vast structures of iron and glass and stone, many of which were photographed in their glory and then demolished within a few short years, their existence surviving only in old images that look almost too magnificent to be real. They ask why a civilization would build such things only to tear them down. and they answer their own question with the same logic that runs through the maps, because those buildings belonged to the old order, and the new order needed them gone. I want to be fair here, because this is the point where the theory reaches farthest and where the ground is softest. The conventional explanations for all of this are real, and they are not stupid. Star forts have a known military purpose. Their shape designed to eliminate blind spots for cannon fire, and their spread is explained by the spread of a particular school of military engineering. The great exhibition halls were often built as temporary structures for world's fairs, always intended to come down, which is why they did. There is a mundane answer for each individual thread. The Tartaria case has never rested on any single one of them. It rests on the accumulation, on the sheer number of separate anomalies that all seem to point back to the same lost period and the same convenient forgetting. Whether that accumulation is a genuine pattern or the mind's hunger for one is the question you have to answer for yourself. But you cannot answer it honestly until you have actually looked at how much there is. And through all of it, the maps remain the strongest evidence, because the maps are the least deniable. A building can be explained by an architect. A word like Tartary can be explained as loose usage. But a coastline that matches a seismic survey taken 400 years later is a very specific, very physical, very stubborn thing. It is a piece of information that should not have been in the hands of the person who drew it. And no amount of talk about temporary exhibition halls or military engineering makes that coastline go away. So let us return to the maps one final time, and let us be precise about what actually happened to them, because this is the crux of everything. Before roughly 1700, the maps are confident. The southern continent is large, detailed, drawn as though the mapmaker had a source he trusted. After roughly 1700, the confidence drains away. Cartographers begin to hedge. They shrink the southern land. They label it uncertain. They fill it with the honest admission that they do not really know what is down there. And within a few generations, the great detailed Antarctica of the old maps is simply gone, replaced by empty ocean and question marks, until the official discovery of 1820 lets the new, sanctioned version take its place. Ask yourself which direction that runs. If humanity was simply learning, the maps would get better over time. More detail, more accuracy. Instead, they got worse. They lost information. The 1739 Buache map, with its eerily correct 2 landmasses, is more accurate to the hidden bedrock of Antarctica than the maps drawn 50 and 100 years after it. That is not how the accumulation of knowledge works. That is how the destruction of knowledge works. Something was known, and then it was unknown, and the maps recorded the unknowing in real time. And we should linger on Piri Reis himself for a moment, because the man left us a confession that most people never read. In his own notes, written in the margins of that famous map, he told us exactly what he did. He said he compiled his chart from many older maps. He mentioned charts drawn in the time of Alexander the Great, more than 1800 years before his own birth. He named a map that had reportedly belonged to Christopher Columbus, a chart that historians have searched for ever since and never found. Piri Reis was not claiming to be a genius who invented this geography. He was telling us plainly that he was a collector and a compiler, stitching together the surviving pieces of a much older and much larger body of knowledge, most of which is now lost to us entirely. Sit with that for a second. The map that has puzzled researchers for over a century, the one with the impossible coastline, is by the mapmaker's own admission only a fragment. It is one surviving corner of something vastly bigger. Piri Reis had access to a library of ancient charts, and he preserved a sliver of them, almost by accident, on a single sheet of skin, in a single palace, in a single city. And that fragment alone was enough to record a coastline beneath the ice. What did the rest of it show? What was on the maps he copied that he did not have room to include, or that he did not think worth mentioning, or that were destroyed before anyone else could study them? We will almost certainly never know. The full picture burned or rotted or was quietly discarded somewhere in the long centuries between the ancient world and the modern one. What we have is the shadow of a shadow, and even the shadow is impossible. That is the part that should genuinely unsettle you. Not that we found strange knowledge on an old map, but that this strange knowledge is what survived by luck, which means it was once part of something enormous that did not survive at all. We are not looking at the whole mystery. We are looking at the one page that slipped through the fire. And this matters far beyond the puzzle of one continent because of what it says about the story we tell ourselves as a species. We like to believe that we are the peak, that history is a ladder and we are standing on the highest rung anyone has ever reached, looking down at everyone who came before us and knew less. That belief is comfortable. It is also, if the maps mean anything, possibly untrue. The maps suggest that knowledge is not a ladder at all. It is a tide. It comes in and it goes out. Civilizations rise, learn extraordinary things, map the whole face of their world, and then fall, and the tide of knowledge goes back out, and most of what they knew is lost, and the survivors are left holding fragments they no longer understand, telling themselves they are the first to have climbed this high. If that is true, then the people who drew the ice-free Antarctica were not our ancestors in the simple sense of being cruder versions of us. They may have been the inheritors of something we lost, or the last witnesses of a world that ended. And the clean-up around the year 1700 was not the beginning of real knowledge, as we are taught. It may have been the final erasure of an older knowledge that had already been fading for a very long time, finished off by powers who found the truth inconvenient to the world they were building. You can feel how much easier it is to just not think about this. To file the Piri-Reis map under coincidence, close the drawer, and go back to the tidy timeline where everything makes sense, and nobody knew about Antarctica until a Russian expedition saw it in 1820. That timeline is soothing. It asks nothing difficult of you. But it also asks you to ignore the gazelle skin in the museum in Istanbul, and the letter from the Air Force officer, and the two lands of the Buash map, and the sunken bridge on the Haji Ahmed chart, and the Portolans that were born perfect and grew worse. It asks you to ignore the receipts. And the whole reason the researchers cannot let this go, the whole reason it has spread from dusty academic footnotes to millions of screens around the world, is that once you have actually seen the receipts, the tidy timeline stops feeling like history and starts feeling like a story someone told you so you would stop asking questions. The official history asks you to believe that 4 separate map makers across 2 centuries all made the same lucky guess about a continent none of them ever saw, that the guess happened to match 20th century seismic surveys, that a professional Air Force cartographer was simply mistaken when he said he could not explain it, that the disappearance of Tartary from every map was pure linguistic tidying, that the consolidation of global trade and the standardization of world geography happening at the same moment was unrelated, and that the whole cluster of anomalies bracketing the year 1700 is nothing but noise. That is a lot of coincidences to hold in your hands at once. The alternative history asks you to believe something that sounds outrageous at first, and then, the longer you sit with the maps, starts to feel almost gentle by comparison. That knowledge is fragile. That civilizations rise higher than we are taught and fall harder than we admit. That someone, long ago, mapped a world we have forgotten, including a continent before its ice. That fragments of that map survived just long enough to be copied by Renaissance hands, and that when a new order of economic powers took control of the world's story, they cleaned the map to match the version of history they needed people to believe. You do not have to accept the grandest version of this. You do not have to sign on to lost empires and mudfloods and rewritten centuries, but you do have to explain the maps, because the maps are real. The Piri-Reis chart still exists, kept in a museum in Istanbul. The Orontius Phineus map exists. The Mercator map exists. The Boache map exists. The Ohlmeyer letter exists. These are not rumours. They are objects you can go and look at. And every one of them is a piece of physical evidence that someone, somehow, knew more about the far south of our planet centuries ago than the official story says was possible. The mainstream has its answers, and some of them are strong, and an honest mind keeps them close. But the anomaly does not go away just because it makes us uncomfortable. It sits there on the gazelle skin, drawn in 1513, a coastline beneath the ice, waiting for someone to explain how it got there. Maybe it really is a bent copy of South America and nothing more. Maybe Boache split his continent by pure accident and got lucky. Maybe Tartary was only ever a careless word. Maybe every thread here has an innocent end, and the pattern is a trick of a mind that wants there to be a pattern. Or maybe the oldest maps are telling the truth, and the newer ones are the lie. Maybe the story we were handed, of knowledge marching ever upward in a straight and honest line, is exactly the kind of story you would write if you were the one holding the pen after the clean-up was done. Maybe the reason every pre-1700 map shows an Antarctica without ice is that someone once stood on that ground or sailed along that coast and drew what they saw. And maybe the reason the maps changed is that the people who inherited the world decided we were better off not knowing. The ice has kept its secrets for a very long time, but paper remembers, and as long as those old maps survive, folded and faded in the archives of the world, the question they raise will not stay buried. Someone knew. The only thing left to figure out is who and what happened to them, and why so much effort was spent on making sure we forgot. There is a strange comfort in mysteries that stay unsolved, and there is a strange terror in them too. The comfort is that the world is bigger and older and deeper than the small, tidy version we are handed in school. The terror is that if this much could be lost, if an entire mapped continent could slip out of human memory and only survive by accident on one sheet of skin, then almost anything could be lost. Whole ages, whole peoples, whole libraries of understanding, gone so completely that we do not even know the shape of the hole they left behind. We measure history in the things that survived. We almost never stop to imagine the vastness of what did not. And maybe that is the real lesson buried in these old charts. Not the specific claim about ice or no ice, not the argument about crustal displacement or trading companies, but the quiet and humbling reminder that we are not the first to think we knew everything. Others stood where we stand, certain of their maps, certain of their timeline, certain that they were the ones who had finally figured it all out. And the tide went out on them too. Their knowledge became our mystery. Their certainty became our footnote. And one day, in some far-off century, the confident maps we draw today may sit in a museum drawer while someone stares at them and wonders how we could possibly have believed the things we believed. The Piri race map does not answer any of this. It only asks. It asks how a working admiral in 1513 drew a coast that matches surveys taken in the age of radar. It asks what was on the older maps he copied and lost. It asks why the great southern land grew clearer as you go backward in time and blurrier as you come forward, when every honest theory of learning says it should be the other way around. It asks who cleaned the map, and when, and what they gained by it. These are not comfortable questions. They are not meant to be. But they are real questions, resting on real objects, and no amount of official confidence has ever made them go away. Look at the maps yourself. Line them up in order. Watch the southern continent appear in full detail, and then slowly dissolve into empty sea. And then ask yourself the only question that really matters. In what kind of history does knowledge run backward? Because that is the thread that ties every piece of this together. Not the ice, not the empires, not the vanished word on the old atlases, but that single backward motion. Knowledge that was sharpest at the start and dimmest at the end. Coastlines that were truest in the oldest hands and vaguest in the newest. A continent that was mapped before it was found and forgotten before it was seen. Run that in the direction we are told history flows, and none of it makes sense. Run it the other way, and suddenly every strange piece falls into place, and the picture it forms is one that no textbook will ever hang on its wall. You are allowed to sit with that discomfort. You are allowed to decide the skeptics are right, and the whole thing is coincidence stacked on coincidence. But you are also allowed to notice how neatly the official story protects itself, how it explains each anomaly one at a time and never has to face them all at once, and how conveniently it flatters the powers that drew the final maps. The answer to that is not written on any map. It is written in the cold and empty space where a continent used to be.